Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Murray Roberts, and I'm a professor of marine biology and ecology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And it's a great pleasure for me today to moderate the discussion. Firstly, let me introduce the university and the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative and Whalewise, the three organizations that have pulled this webinar together. I'd also like to acknowledge the projects that have provided some sponsorship and support, the European Atlas and Atlantic projects, and also the One Ocean Hub. So thinking back, deep sea nodules, manganese nodules, were discovered in the 1870s during the Challenger expedition, an expedition led by Charles Wyville Thomson of the University of Edinburgh. And since then, the prospects for deep sea mining have been, people have been aware, but nothing has developed. It's been a rather quiet scenario. In 1972, I was reading the reports, the 100th anniversary conference reports from the Challenger expedition, a meeting that was held in Edinburgh in 1972, and J. Robert Moore from the University of Wisconsin made some predictions there of profitable mining from the Pacific of deep sea manganese nodules by 1975. Well, a lot has happened since 1975, but the exploitation of deep sea minerals hasn't yet started. We're now seeing deep sea mining as a fascinating and highly important geopolitical issue. And it may be one issue that's at the nexus of many important issues society has to grapple with. Is it indeed something that might help societies move to a low carbon, sustainable future? Are deep sea minerals essential in the technologies required for a massive reinvention of our energy supplies or not? Our webinar today is trying to pull together these issues. In a couple of hours, we can't run through each and every issue, but we have a fantastic array of speakers who are going to look at the issues through different lenses and take different perspectives. We want to have an active discussion around these issues. I'll talk to you about how we can organize that together in a second. Deep sea mining, as I've mentioned, brings together so many important issues. In areas beyond national jurisdiction, these resources are managed for the common heritage of humankind through UNCLOS. There are issues again around the governance, the details of how that common heritage will be secured versus the value and the importance of the ecosystems within which these minerals are found. There's recently been calls, in fact, more than recently, over the last 10 years or so, there have been calls for even a moratorium on deep sea mining while the scientific community gathers evidence and gathers a better understanding of the deep ocean. So I think as we enter the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, it's fantastic so early in 2021 to pause and reflect on these issues and reiterate from all perspectives. And I will move to our first speaker this evening. It's a very great pleasure to introduce to you Daniela Ipgarasas, who will introduce life in the deep sea. Daniela is a deep sea ecologist originally from Colombia, and she's now completing a PhD at the Universidade Federal do Espírito Santo in Brazil. Her thesis is entitled Climate Change Impacts on Deep Sea Benthic Assemblages in the Atlantic Ocean. And as the coordinator of iAtlantic, I'm absolutely delighted and honored that Daniela is an iAtlantic fellow. So Daniela, over to you.
So, yes. Okay. So, hi, good afternoon, good evening. So let's talk about life in the deep sea. I don't know how to, okay. Everything is fine? Yes, okay. So the Earth is the only known planet in the solar system with liquid water on its surface. And 2/3 corresponds to waters with more than 3,000 meters depth. But most are still unexplored. So the deep sea is the largest and least explored habitat on Earth. It took a long time for researchers to believe that life could exist on the seafloor, because this environment has extreme conditions that are very different from other marine and terrestrial ecosystems. So what is the deep blue like? So the deep sea is a harsh environment. It's a world without sunlight, with freezing and higher temperatures, extremely high pressures, low oxygen levels, and scarce food. So, however, oceanographic expeditions using new technologies in deeper waters have discovered that the fauna that lives there is completely amazing, with hotspots of biodiversity that are still largely unexplored. So this high biodiversity is because of the unique physical and geological characteristics of the seafloor and the water column that provide different habitats with different fauna communities. As extraordinary benthic ecosystems, as hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, some vast fields as abyssal plains, and diversity hotspots as sea mounds, cold water corals, and canyons. So all these ecosystems and their fauna play a key role regulating the climate on the Earth, making the planet habitable for us. Also, they provide us with food, and their genetic resources provide enormous potential for human benefit in scientific research and bioprospecting, where the natural compounds are extracted from marine organisms or microorganisms to produce pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, healthcare products, and agrochemicals. So, what is hiding in these deep sea ecosystems? Okay, so the deep sea starts around 200 meters here below the surface of the ocean when the sunlight starts to fade. So the temperature is not too cold here, and there are some sunlight available for photosynthesis. So in the mesopelagic zone or twilight zone, we can see a lot of commercial fishes and other organisms, a lot of invertebrates, and some mammals and turtles can swim up to 1,000 meters depth. So in this zone, in 1,000 meters depth, the completely darkness starts. So without sunlight, there are not photosynthesis, and the animals depend mostly of the quantity and quality of food produced in the surface and descends to the seafloor. So in the water column, depth, penetration of light, and temperature will determine the diversity and distribution of the fauna. So as we go deeper into the ocean, the fauna is changing from colorful organisms to bioluminescent organisms that produce light in a form for communication with other animals. So they produce light, they emit light to find food, attract prey, find a mate, for defend from predators. And some fishes have big eyes, as this viperfish, and large teeth, skull, and stomach to secure their food for several days. And other organisms have jelly-like bodies to resist high pressures, as some sea cucumbers and octopus jellyfish. Some fishes have jelly-like bodies too. And in the bottom, on the seafloor, in the bottom of the sea, so are the benthic fauna waiting for some piece of food. So leaving the bottom occurs in a slow motion. The benthic communities are mainly determined by a strong food limitation. So that's why the organisms have a slow metabolism, slow growth, but a long life. So benthic organisms are closely linked with the sediment, and any disturbance on it will affect the survival. Corals, starfishes, or sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and another organisms living on the sediment, and the macro and meiofauna is hiding inside the sediment. So we can see them with the naked eye because they are so tiny, but in these groups, we can see ctonidaceans, nematodes, polychaetes, and other crustaceans, and they have very small bodies, but they are very sensitive, and some of them, as these polychaetes, have big jaws to catch their prey. So in 1 square meter of sediment, we can find 400 different species of these groups. So these little animals compose the majority of the deep sea life. And also inside the sediment are bacteria and other microorganisms too. So ecosystems as abyssal plains are really not deserts of life, because even if the benthic fauna is sparse, there's also a lot of small organisms inside the sediment. And one of the most important ecosystems in the sea bottom are the reducing ecosystems or extreme ecosystems, as the hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. They are the exception to the food limitation in the bottom of the sea, because in this, the bacteria play the key role of primary producer, transforming the chemicals into food. So in these ecosystems, the biodiversity is low. The communities are dominated by a few unique or endemic species, as tube worms, jetty crabs, some mollusks, but in great abundance. So these ecosystems, these extreme ecosystems, together with sea mounds and other environments altered by volcanic and tectonic processes, are of great interest for researchers and industry. They provide structure and a good food supply for some animals to live on, and have special geological characteristics, as the presence of minerals. So while hydrothermal vents are like underwater geysers expelling super hot and toxic fluids and supporting a fauna with incredible adaptations, sea mounds are underwater islands isolated from other deep sea ecosystems that support a high biodiversity, being called oases of sea life. So both ecosystems are home to many endemic species that are not found in any other ecosystem on Earth, and depend on these environments to survive. So to finish, I want to highlight that we don't know much of the diversity hidden in the ocean, and threats such as the climate change and anthropogenic disturbance are impacting the ocean, making it warmer, more acidic, and less oxygenated, affecting the important fauna of the deep sea and the important resources that the ocean provides us. So I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm sure this webinar will be very productive and informative for all of us. Thank you.
Daniela, thank you so much for that lovely introduction to life in the deep sea and for showing us so many very beautiful images. During the webinar, please do send questions, and we have kept aside a minute or so for your questions after each speaker. We've also kept aside half an hour at the end of the webinar for a discussion. So if you're still thinking of questions, don't hold back, send them into the question box. Daniela, I'll let you know if we have any questions for you. But at this point, I'd like to now move on from that basic introduction to life in the deep sea to actually think a little bit about what deep sea mining is and what it might entail. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Samantha Smith, who will introduce the topic of deep sea mining to us today. Sam has a PhD from the University of Bristol and has worked on the environmental aspects of deep sea mining for the last 15 years. She's based in Canada and is currently head of sustainability at Global Sea Mineral Resources. She's also director of Blue Globe Solution, a consultancy focused on sustainable solutions and the responsible use of the oceans. So Sam, without further ado, I pass the microphone to you. Thank you.
Perfect, we can see.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Marie, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us today. To begin, let's take a moment to consider the supply and demand of critical metals that we're currently facing. And I'll start by talking about our growing global population and increased urbanization. So over the next 30 years, the global population is set to expand by 2 billion people. The UN's projected rate of urban population growth requires the equivalent of a city the size of New York to be built every 11 weeks between now and the end of the century. That's a phenomenal ask, a phenomenal task ahead of us. And of course, this will put a huge strain on the mineral resources that we extract from our Earth. Both urban infrastructure and clean energy technologies are metal intensive. In particular, we need metals such as nickel, cobalt, manganese, and copper. And without a doubt, recycling has a critical role to play in meeting future metal demand. But unfortunately, as it stands right now, recycling alone isn't enough to bridge the supply gap for many decades to come. Part of the reason for this is that metals bound in infrastructure don't become available again for some time. In the case of offshore wind turbines, this is for up to 30 years. So an offshore wind turbine built today with these metals wouldn't have those metals again available for 30 years or until 2050, 2051. Additionally, modern engineering leads to more challenging product disassembly. And what that means is it's hard to get metals out. Products haven't typically been designed thinking that eventually they will be recycled. This is changing, but in the past it wasn't the case. And it's not easy to extract the specific metals that we need. I'll go back one more point. The projections tell us that we will need new sources of metal. And here we have choices to make. We can keep looking for resources on land, but we have to take a moment and ask ourselves, is that the most environmentally and socially responsible approach? And could there be another way? We all know that we live on the blue planet, and it's blue because 70% of it is covered by water, as Daniela just mentioned. Historically, mining has focused on the other 30% of the planet, made up by land. Or another way to look at it, mining to date has focused on the rare part of our planet, the part we live on, giving rise to land use conflicts and a multitude of other issues. Often rainforests have to be cleared, mountains flattened, communities displaced, and large amounts of waste, much of it toxic, generated. And whether we like it or not, obtaining resources from our planet is going to involve impacts, or it does involve impacts, and it involves choices. We need, or my call is to think about our planet and its resources holistically, not land versus sea, but what is best for our planet as a whole, and make choices, wise choices accordingly. You will hear in other talks about different types of seabed mineral resources. So there are 3 main types. Each have their own characteristics, each have their own environmental issues and descriptions and characteristics. This talk focuses on these things called polymetallic nodules, which sit unattached on the bottom of the seafloor. They cover extensive areas of the ocean's abyssal plains, and they're rich in the exact metals we need for clean energy technology, so nickel, cobalt, manganese, and copper. The highest known concentration of polymetallic nodules are found in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or CCZ, which is located between Hawaii and Mexico in the Pacific Ocean, between 4,000 and 6,000 meters water depth. The governing body for seabed minerals in the area beyond national jurisdiction is the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, established through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 1994 Implementing Agreement. The ISA is comprised of 167 member states and the EU. To date, only mineral exploration contracts have been issued. No mining has begun, and there are no mining contract applications currently underway. The deep seabed mineral sector is in a research phase, and that's a very important point to make. They are focused, or the sector is focused on getting the science right so that we can make informed science-based decisions about the appropriate way forward. There is much interest in the CCZ nodules because they contain more nickel, more cobalt, and more manganese than the entire terrestrial reserve base for those metals. Additionally, intuitively, there appear to be a number of environmental and social advantages compared to land-based alternatives, such as no deforestation, no social displacement. This slide is just a reminder, and Murray alluded to it earlier, that deep seabed mining isn't an entirely new idea. During the 1970s, 4 consortia spent a combined equivalent of about $1 billion in today's money to study and recover polymetallic nodules and process them from the CCZ. Over 1,500 tons of nodules were successfully recovered and metal cathodes were produced. At the time, there was no clear way to obtain an exploration permit, and this impeded further advancement at that time. Since then, the International Seabed Authority has been established and the mining code has been some 26 years in the making. Now flipping to modern day, this slide shows an overview of GSR's proposed mining system, which is comprised of 4 key components. Starting at the seafloor, you have harvesting units that collect nodules and separate them from the surrounding sediment. Their nodules are taken or transported through a vertical transport system via a riser to a surface vessel. On the surface vessel, the nodules are separated from the seawater. The nodules then go on to a bulk carrier for transport, and the seawater that's been separated needs to be returned to the ocean at some depth. In GSR's case, we've committed to this discharge depth being no shallower than 2,000 meters water depth and possibly back down to the seafloor. And the environmental impact assessment we're undertaking will elucidate the most environmentally appropriate depth for discharge with input from the scientific community. This is an artist's impression also of the land-based plant on the right. And you can now more easily see also some of the monitoring equipment that will be in place during the mining operation, which includes autonomous underwater vehicles and a series of moored oceanographic equipment. The current focus of GSR is the development of the harvesting unit technology, which involves a hydraulic nodule collector mounted on a tracked undercarriage. GSR is taking a step-by-step to project development and is currently focused on delivering a successful deep sea trial of its pre-prototype nodule collector, which is expected to occur in the first half of this year. This vehicle is also known as Petania 2. Previously, in 2017, GSR successfully trialed a tracked soil testing device to test and improve maneuverability and trafficability. And this little machine called Petania 1 did not collect any nodules, it simply drove around on the seafloor. In 2021, GSR will trial the bigger vehicle, which will drive around on the seafloor and collect nodules, and the nodule collection system will be tested. And then in the 2021 trial will not yet entail a riser to bring the nodules to the surface. Later, GSR will test a prototype commercial scale nodule collector called Petania 3, which will have a riser to bring nodules from the surface, from the seafloor to the surface vessel. The idea behind the step-by-step process is to do a little bit at a time, learn and improve each time we go out, eventually coming up with a final design. Environmental monitoring is an integral part of this program, and the results of all these trials will be written up in the environmental impact statement for full-scale operations, which will be made public. Oops. Okay, quick next step. All these trials that I mentioned will undergo environmental monitoring, and for Petania 2, GSR has agreed that a consortium of independent scientists will monitor the upcoming Petania 2 trial. The knowledge gained will be incorporated into the next phase of design, and the Petania 3 trial will be similarly monitored. This slide just summarizes GSR's approach to environmental management, containing several pillars. An important point is that we are partnering with the scientific community to ensure decisions are made on the best science possible, and that partnering scientists are free to publish their findings. Getting the science right, as I mentioned, is critical. We cannot make decisions based on guesses or emotion. We must have the facts. And GSR is committed to the highest standards in science, engineering, and transparent communication while maintaining a focus on helping to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I can see by Murray's appearance that I'm running out of time. Apologies for that, Murray. But I'll just say here that a lot of thoughts, I can't go through each of these at the moment, but a lot of thought does go into reducing environmental effects. With some ideas listed here, there are many, many more than this. And that's part of the program and part of the development right from the start and all the way through. And I'll leave you here with a summary slide, just that the world's demand for metals is rising. New solutions must be explored. Polymetallic nodules can help diversify the world's supply. Absolutely, a precautionary approach is needed to make sure that we're carrying out the science, engineering, impact analysis in the most appropriate, responsible way possible. Commitment to the highest standards in environmental science, engineering, and transparent communication is essential, as are partnerships to achieve the goals. An important point is that deep sea seabed mining is not a fait accompli. The research currently being undertaken is about keeping an option open. And my last point is that never before in history has so much pre-thought gone into regulating an industry that doesn't yet exist. Thank you so much for your time.
Sam, many thanks to you for that presentation. And I also wanted to say how exciting it is to see people genuinely from all across every corner of our planet. I mean, it's amazing. I'm seeing people from the Cook Islands, from across Europe, from across North America and South America, and even closer to home, the Western Isles of Scotland. It's wonderful to see you all. So please let's move to our next speaker, Pradeep Singh, who will outline regulation of deep sea mining with a particular focus on the International Seabed Authority, which you heard introduced by Sam in her presentation. Now, Pradeep is a research associate for the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany, and a PhD candidate at the University of Bremen. Pradeep's expertise lies in ocean policy. His current project of focus is deep sea mining, test mining, and fair benefit sharing. And I'm very happy to say that Pradeep is an alumnus of the University of Edinburgh. So Pradeep, over to you.
Thank you very much, Murray, and real pleasure to speak here today, and especially because I first learned about deep seabed mining while I was a student at the University of Edinburgh. So yeah, really happy to be here. So again, Murray in his introduction told us that, you know, it was about 1870 when we first discovered deep sea mineral resources, polymetallic nodules in this case, as Samantha took us through it. But it was only in the 1960s that we first had global attention towards, you know, commercializing these resources with the book by John Merrow in 1965. So when we talk about deep seabed mining, basically it involves the exploration, but especially the eventual exploitation of mineral resources, looking at depths of more than 200 meters onwards. One thing to note is that deep seabed mining can take place in areas that are located within national jurisdiction, as well as beyond national jurisdiction, i.e. the international seabed, which is technically known as the area. So if we are talking about mining within national jurisdiction, coastal states have sovereign rights over these resources. But when we are talking about beyond national jurisdiction, then there's no sovereignty or no sovereign rights by any one particular state. Instead, access is only through the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. And as Samantha has mentioned, exploitation is yet to take place at a commercial scale anywhere, so both within and beyond national jurisdiction. So today I'll be focused more on the mineral resources of the area and the work of the ISA. Now, just to give you a sort of an understanding of the maritime zones and where we are talking about, where the area is, as you can see in the bottom right of the diagram, it sort of basically starts where the sovereign rights of coastal states end. And the area is basically where the ISA has jurisdiction. So again, in coming back to 1965, and when this book was first published, this sort of created a very nervous, febrile atmosphere among international actors. You would, of course, remember that this is shortly after the Second World War and the post-colonization era. So there were many newly independent states that were underdeveloped, and they were very interested in these resources. And there was, of course, the concern that only a few developed and industrialized states would be able to reach and profit from them. So this led to a famous speech in 1967 by an ambassador from Malta, basically imploring the international community to declare these resources that are beyond national jurisdiction as a matter of common interest. Then, of course, this was then taken up at the UN General Assembly. In 1970, we had a resolution declaring these resources to be the common heritage of mankind, to be administered by an international regime. And it was at the same time decided that an intergovernmental conference will be convened to basically negotiate a binding instrument to give legal effect to this understanding. Now, premised on negotiations that started since 1973, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted in 1982. So this is either LOSC, UNCLOS, or the convention, basically, which Murray alluded to in his introduction. In this convention, there is a dedicated section for the area and the mineral resources. It's basically called Part 11 of the convention. And this part established the International Seabed Authority, which is now based in Kingston, Jamaica. And it sort of provided a regulatory framework for mining activities to take place in the area. What is important to note is that the Law of the Sea Convention did not enter into force immediately after it was adopted. There was resistance that mostly came from developed and emerging big developing economies. And the main disagreement of these actors was on Part 11. So there was a lot of disagreements on deep seabed mining in the area. So then this required further negotiations. Some concessions had to come from developing countries. And eventually in 1994, we had an agreement to implement Part 11 of the convention, which modified and to some extent weakened certain parts of Part 11 in UNCLOS. But this eventually paved the way for the whole convention to receive overwhelming support and come into force. And with that, the ISA was actually born. Now, what does UNCLOS actually, or the Law of the Sea Convention actually say about deep seabed mining? It declares under Article 136 that these resources are the common heritage of mankind. 137 sort of amplifies this and say that no state can claim sovereignty or sovereign rights over these resources. Article 141 says that mining shall be carried out for the benefit of mankind as a whole. Article 140, subparagraph 2 says that whatever financial and economic benefits that come from it shall be shared equitably. And importantly, Article 145 says that necessary measures must be taken to ensure the effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of mining. Now, how does it all work? So the ISA is an international organization basically made out of all contracting parties, which, as Samantha mentioned, is 167 countries and the EU. The main responsibilities of the ISA basically first is to design a system to allow the exploration and exploitation of mineral resources, basically to develop specific rules, regulations, and procedures. Now, you will remember that the convention only gives a regulatory framework and it then puts it on the ISA to develop specific rules and regulations. ISA is also required to adopt necessary measures to ensure the effective protection of the marine environment. ISA will also consider and approve individual applications for mining activities. The ISA is also entrusted to determine financial terms for contractors. So basically how much contractors would need to pay into the ISA for their mining contracts, and to then also collect payments from contractors. And with this money, the ISA has to establish a benefit sharing or equitable distribution mechanism to distribute the money. Interestingly, it also has to provide a system of compensation to developing countries whose economies are dependent on terrestrial mining. And these countries could suffer adverse impacts due to deep seabed mining. So basically, they have to be compensated for their sort of losses that affect their economies due to seabed mining. ISA is also required to supervise and ensure compliance by contractors, as well as to promote marine scientific research, technology transfer, and capacity building. So up until today, there have been some 30 exploration contracts that have been awarded, one more in the pipe. So it has been just approved last month and the contract would be signed presumably soon. Whereas regulations to enable exploitation, as Samantha mentioned, are not yet enforced. They are actually currently under negotiation, so they have not been finalized yet. Now, just to basically put it all together to say what the ISA is, there are three primary organs. So you have the Assembly, the Council, and the Secretariat. Now, the Assembly is where all the contracting parties are represented. So the 167 countries are there. They each have one vote. And they could basically determine or finalize the rules, regulations, and procedures of the entire ISA, but they have to do this based on the recommendations of the Council. Now, the Council is comprised of only 36 member states, which are elected by the Assembly, and they are divided into certain groups. For example, groups that are invested in deep seabed mining, states that are invested in deep seabed mining, states that are importers of commodities that come from deep seabed mining, and also states that are exporters of commodities, basically from terrestrial mining sources, as well as equitable geographic distribution. And then there's the Legal and Technical Commission that provides advice to the Council. And this is basically the expert body that provides advice to the council. Who can mine? So basically, you would of course need the prior approval from the ISA, explore first and then exploit. Applicants basically can determine where and what resource type they want to apply for, but some areas are reserved for developing states. And if you're intending to apply for a mining contract, well, it's open to all member states of the convention. It's open also to the enterprise, which is not yet in operation. And then it's also open to state-owned enterprises and private entities, provided they are sponsored by a member state. Member states can sponsor their own nationals as well as foreign nationals, but it's important to note that both of these elements need to be met. Liability and enforcement, especially for environmental harm, is possible. This can be possible under international law, so states and sponsoring states that engage in mining, as well as domestic law, so contractors can be responsible there. So I see that Mari is already here, so I'm just going to quickly conclude. The ocean and its problems are interconnected, and this was already known in 1982 because this is stated in the preamble of the convention. The Law of the Sea Convention needs to be integrated with other related developments, including the Sustainable Development Goals, as Samantha has brought up, as well as the interests of future generations. And recently, the UN Secretary General has said that the threats to the ocean today are unprecedented. And of course, once commercial scale exploitation starts, then the oceans will be susceptible to increased pressures. Now, there are problems with the ISA and how things are being done at the moment, and these need to be addressed quite soon. From an institutional perspective, assembly meetings are poorly attended. So we talked about 160 odd countries. Less than 80 of them tend to typically show up for meetings. Decision-making at council, as I said, 36 members, and even that their votes are divided by groups. This tends to lean towards mining, and the main expert body lacks specific expertise, particularly environmental expertise, and there are questions of transparency. Scientific and environmental aspects, there are many uncertainties of the scale of harm. Countries are yet to agree on the ambit of serious harm, but so basically the threshold where mining cannot happen. And there also sort of lacks some precautionary and adaptive approaches, and these need to be improved so that the regulator can intervene. From a regulatory perspective, ISA is actually at the moment over-reliant on contractors, so it needs to be more proactive. The financial model that is currently being designed perhaps is on the side of attracting contractors or incentivizing mining. And there's basically no full clarity on what sponsoring states have to do and what effective control actually means. So I'll just end with the statement that the area and its mineral resources are the common heritage of mankind. And at this point in time now, member states need to look into the legitimacy of this activity. So not the legality, but the legitimacy of this activity, and ask if mining can be conducted basically for the benefit of mankind as a whole. If the answer to that is yes, how do we do that? So thank you very much.
Pradeep, thank you very much for that really insightful summary, really fascinating. So I'm now delighted to introduce to you Pippa Howard from Flora and Fauna International. Pippa is going to discuss deep sea mining and society. So if deep sea mining were to go ahead, would there be benefits to all of humankind, and how would the industry be held accountable by the public? I think Pradeep's overview has really set the context beautifully for this. Now, Pippa has a varied background in biodiversity management, impact assessment, development, and sustainability. She is currently Director of Extractives and Development Infrastructure Program at FFI, and she was lead author of the recent Flora and Fauna report and assessment of the risks and impacts of seabed mining on marine ecosystems. So Pippa, over to you.
Thanks very much, Murray, and good evening, everybody. Yes, I've been asked to look at deep sea mining and the role of society, and found that this is really focused on two current questions which keep popping up, and that's around the benefits and who should be held accountable. So the question needs to be contextualized, in my mind anyway, in the marine ecosystem, and this is where seabed mining is proposed. And regardless of whether this is going to take place in national or international waters, it's really important for us to understand the marine ecosystems and the risks and impacts of seabed mining to the health, function, and persistence of biodiversity in the marine environment. So briefly, the ocean is a highly connected three-dimensional system, and we've seen some of the complexity of the biodiversity there already. But it's an ecosystem fundamental to the function of our climate, to maintaining the balance of nutrients, oxygen, trace metals, carbon, etc. on the planet. And it's an extraordinarily complex ecological and biochemical functions that regulate these processes, thereby enabling life on Earth. So the life forms biodiversity that are integral to these processes are highly evolved. They're incredibly biodiverse and fundamentally associated with the substrates and geological compounds that are the focus of mining. And we know from terrestrial mines that unique biodiversity is associated with unique geochemistry. And the same is true of the oceans. Now, the link between the unique microbes and the fauna of the ocean sediments and substrates, such as polymetallic nodules, are quite simply because their origins are intertwined. They evolved symbiotically, just as clays and corals and hydrocarbons and rare earth minerals evolved from unique past biological and chemical conditions, as have carbonates, so cement and limestone. These are all formed from life forms of past environmental conditions. And also the most usable forms of minerals come in from concentrates, so the deposits and secretions of life forms. So when thinking about the benefits and accountability, we have to think about the risks and impacts associated with deep sea mining, some of which are shown in these two slides. The first looks at the complex biodiversity hotspots of seamounts that Daniela showed us pictures of. And the second looks at complex benthic ecosystems and ecological the system's functions associated with the abyssal plains and polymetallic nodules. Now, I'm happy to share the link to the report that Murray referred to, which addressed some of these impacts in detail, and we will be looking at that later in the seminar. So I'm going to go back to the questions. Now, the nature of these questions requires two parts. So let's have a look at the benefits. And first, I think we need to look at who actually owns these resources. And in the first place, because this is really what should define to whom and how the benefits are assigned. Now, this seabed mining is proposed in both national and international waters, as we've heard, and Pradeep gave us a fantastic introduction to that, as did Sam. Now, those in national waters fall within national laws and regulation, and I won't go into the benefits of these, as they fall within sovereign governance and would likely form part of the same legal premises as terrestrial mining. Most of those benefits seem to go to corporations or corporate entities, regardless of their country of origins or registration. And there's a lot of issues, or is be subject to a lot of discussion around that. But I'm going to focus on the international waters in what is termed the area, which is where the biggest threat to our ocean currently lies. Again, thanks to those before me who've explained where and what these are. So the important thing here is that this is the global commons. It belongs to everyone on the planet. It is common heritage of mankind or humankind. And during the last few decades, the notion of common heritage of mankind has attracted considerable attention and obviously generated polemical debate in various international forums. And this has been especially true of the common heritage of mankind's application to the legal status of the resources in these common space areas. And particularly hot in these discussions has been the ocean floor, of outer space, the moon, Antarctica, etc. But one of the central premises of the common heritage is that these regions would not be subject to appropriation of any kind, either public, national, or corporate, and that common space areas would be regarded legally as regions owned by no one, but hypothetically managed by everyone. So the benefits would be for everyone and managed by everyone. So sovereignty would be absent. It would be, as would all its legal attributes and ramifications, thus no jurisdictional rights or privileges and obligations would exist, and no agent or of any authority would exist to enforce such commands in the regions. Now, of course, we've got the ISA, which has a very specific remit here. So, you know, that sort of bends the rules essentially of what was initially there. Outer space is deemed one of mankind's common heritages, and the joint members of the UN, for example, called for all countries to preserve the use of outer space for peaceful purposes and the advancement of sustainable development. So there are precedents here too. Now, Pradeep also talked about the United Nations Convention the law of the sea, and which states that very clearly that the seabed requires stewardship for the benefit of all humankind. And there are various things that he spoke to which would cover really just what the boundaries of that are. But critical to some of those sort of mandates that lie within UNCLOS are about the benefits to mankind as a whole, and what it is that the authority should be doing around things like marine scientific research and how that can benefit to all of humankind. So we've heard about the role of the ISA. This UN agency should be responsible for applying UNCLOS. However, it seems that most activity in the ISA has been around enabling mining, and I think that's something Pradeep mentioned too. They define benefits to humankind as the kind of financial gains potentially to be made from exploitation and mining of the deep seabed. They see the benefits paid as royalties and taxes to account for this extraordinary responsibility laid out by UNCLOS. Now, if all humankind were to benefit from these activities, what would this look like? And what would society do about it? And what would be the relative financial benefits that each individual would get relative to the corporate benefits that we know are the sort of profits that are currently under the eyes of mining? So the ISA does talk about the benefits of humankind of things like cheaper minerals, access to increased options for sustainable minerals. They talk about scientific research and data. There's a wealth generation for sponsoring states. But in more than 30 years of operation, the ISA is still slightly murky on this, and these things have not been clearly defined. And they seem still to be unable to allocate those benefits. So companies involved are currently talking about benefits of DSM-2, and they talk about them in terms of sustainable sourcing of minerals and as a solution to our climate change challenges. And these are, valid direction of argument, of course. But they also offering interests in an interesting array of social services and subsidies to some of the sort of sponsoring states, such as some of the Pacific Island states. So these allocations of a few $1,000s are way more than perhaps would be seen as the benefits to all humankind delivered from actual mining. So in the interest of time, let me briefly go to the accountability. Who needs to be held account, and which part of industry and who will make these decisions? So deep sea mining is about the supply chain of raw materials for technology and infrastructure. So part of the accountability is about society's role in demanding responsible and sustainable supply chains. This is a market demand. So ultimately, society has the power and the influence to do the checks and balances on seabed mining, which is what moved the International Whaling Commission, for example, and helped to create the Antarctic Convention to reach international agreements, which were for the benefit of humankind and resulted in a moratorium, for example, of mineral exploitation in Antarctica. So how does society actually ensure responsible supply chains? Well, through societal pressure and holding decision makers to account. And at the moment, as Pradeep pointed out, very few countries are adequately represented in the membership of the ISA. They need to be far more transparent. They need to be held accountable to the mandate which they're called to under UNCLOS. And we as members of society need to call on our governments, on their representatives in the Assembly, to the Council of the ISA, to consider their mandate and to hold the ISA to account and to test the legal frameworks that have been set up there and to call on their own national constituencies. We also need to look at other high seas and ocean users to see what they feel and how this may impact their sort of ocean economies. So society really needs to know more about deep sea mining, and this seminar is an incredibly important part of that process. And they need to know that in a transparent and honest way. They need to take responsibility for their role in it through changing their own practices and expectations. They need to think carefully about where their raw materials come from. We all need to waste less. We need to understand the implications of our own consumerism. And finally, society really needs to hold account those who are empowered to make decisions on their behalf. Thanks, Murray. And thanks, everyone. Right, there we go.
Thank you so much, Pippa. That was fantastic. So our next speaker will be Matthias Haeckel, and Matthias will discuss the potential environmental impacts of deep sea mining. Matthias is a research scientist at GEOMAR, the Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Kiel, Germany. He's been based there since 2005, but has been working on the impacts of deep sea resource exploitation for the last 25 years, particularly the impacts of deep sea mining. Currently, Matthias coordinates the European project Mining Impact, whose results contribute to the negotiations of the ISA's mining code. Matthias, over to you.
Can you hear me now? I think I got muted again.
We hear you well.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, Murray, for the introduction. Yes, so I'm, as Murray introduced already, I'm the coordinator of a large European project with 30 partner institutions, and we're looking into the potential environmental impacts and risks of deep sea mining. To do so, we have focused in the past 5 years on the impacts from polymetallic nodule mining, because this is potentially the resource that might get exploited first, followed then by massive sulfides and cobalt-rich crusts, which are the other two marine deep sea minerals that of interest. The impacts, to summarize what this would entail for polymetallic nodules. So there will be this collector system driving over the seafloor, picking up the nodules, and this typically would involve the removal of the nodules plus the upper 10 centimeters of the seafloor. This is also what the first tests in the lab from GSR have shown, and we will see in spring this year how much centimeters this will actually entail. And in the deep sea, the 10 centimeters of seafloor means we're taking away basically the entire ecosystem where the larger fauna from myofauna up to macro and megafauna lives in. Only some of the bacteria will remain below. So 10 centimeters is this active layer in the deep sea on global average that we call the bioturbation layer. Then the second one is that just by driving with this caterpillar-like machines over the seafloor, a sediment plume will be created, but also from the sediments that will be separated from the nodules already in the mining vehicle itself, because you don't want to carry this additional weight up to the sea surface and then transport to land. Further cleaning will probably take place on these surface infrastructures, platforms or vessels, and this waste plume has to be re-injected then. We have already shown in scientific projects more than 20 years ago that this return water plume should be injected as close to the seafloor as possible to minimize the spread through the ocean. So that there have been some modeling exercises on that in the past 20 to 30 years, and they showed that. But colleagues are also looking with more modern numerical models into this again. So these will be the main impacts, and the sediment plume, either the return water plume or the one created directly by the machine on the seafloor, will drift with a slow bottom currents and resettle also on areas outside of these mined areas. So for polymetallic nodule miners, for economic reasons, the mining area per year per contractor or operation is expected to be something like 200 to 300 square kilometers. So these are large areas. The size of Munich, German city, is about 200 square kilometers. So per area of operation per year, this kind of impact area where the fauna plus the nodules are removed. The sediment plume dispersal, we at the moment by numerical modeling, because we haven't been able to follow up a test so far. This will happen in spring this year with GSR's tests. We expect that the mining plume will create an impact area that can be something like 2 to 5 times larger than this. So then we're getting closer to something like 1,000 square kilometers per year per operation. The only larger impact that we do on that size is tree cutting of rainforests. In these impacted areas, we will have loss of habitat, loss of species and genetic diversity, the loss of ecosystem structure and functions, and we also change the surface sediment characteristics chemically, but also mechanically. And so the big question that we all have to answer, because this is a societal question, since the seafloor resources are the human heritage of mankind, as Pradeep has introduced, is how much is acceptable. What we've learned in these past decades and also in the past 6 years in our project is that the nodule ecosystem supports a highly diverse fauna of sessile and mobile species. And here you can see a few sessile species from sea anemones or corals, mobile ones like sea cucumbers or other kinds of worms or jellyfish. Stalked sponges are a main structure in these ecosystems. They are attached typically to the nodules and provide another additional specific habitat for other mobile faunas like this ophiuroid sea star that climb up on these stalked sponge structures to better feed probably in the water column the food. So nodule ecosystems are a very specific habitat in the deep sea. And faunal communities and also our environmental parameters or variables show a high variability even on very local spatial scale. And with this small spatial scale, this is on a few meters size or distance, these parameters and the community structures already change, not just over thousands of kilometers. And to visualize a little bit how these impacts what the impacts may be also on longer timescales, we looked at old benthic impact experiments that had been done already 20 to 30 years ago. These are little dredge tracks, 2 meter wide, maybe 1,000 meter long. So nothing compared in the size to what deep sea mining operations in industrial scale will do. Here you see the oldest track in the Clarion-Clipperton zone that exists. It's an old dredge track from OMCO, a company that did some experiments and exploration now almost 42 years ago. And here is a picture from a fresh one that was towed a year before we did our investigations. And I typically show this picture because it shows quite nicely what we expect from a mining collector vehicle, that it actually takes away the nodules plus these top 10 centimeters of the seafloor. So this is on large scale also what we expect what a nodule collector system will do. And here you see outside these old tracks what the species composition of megafauna are. So these large animals like holothurians, the sea cucumbers, in areas with nodules and in areas also without nodules in the deep sea. And you can clearly see that the sessile fauna abundances of these megafauna is much larger in areas with nodules because they need these nodules as a specific habitat. So nodule habitats have higher abundances typically of fauna, at least macro and megafauna, than in typical soft seafloor sediments without these nodules. And surprisingly, we see the same picture for mobile fauna. So for these sea stars and holothurians and so on, because, as I already showed, they need these stalked sponge structures that live on the nodules, so the specific sessile fauna as a specific habitat. So also mobile fauna is much more abundant in areas with nodules. And this is how the picture looks like even almost 4 decades after these small experimental disturbances that have been investigated. Not just the sessile fauna that is clear, the nodules are gone. So the sessile fauna that primarily needs the nodules, of course, can't come back and regrow, but also the mobile fauna abundances have not recovered after almost 4 decades. So the disturbance from impacts last for many decades. They are long lasting. And we also have a loss of seafloor integrity that reduces the population densities and with it also the ecosystem functions. And this affects the entire different ecosystem compartments. And this is what I can show here. So we were not just interested in mega and macrofauna and myofauna impacts, but also how the microbial communities in the sediments react to these disturbances. And that was something we had not expected, that also these activities are significantly reduced after 3 to 4 decades still. So they do not recover within several tens of years time frame. And since they are the basis of an ecosystem, degrading the organic carbon, producing the nutrient refluxes into the ecosystem, this means that very likely the ecosystem will be impacted over several hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. And that is something we have to keep in mind. So these areas where the nodules will be mined will be basically lost on geological timescales. So really long timescales, hundreds to thousands of years. And the specific habitat, the nodules, since that's basically removed with the mining operations, of course, will not regrow within these timescales. This is lost for millions of years because that's the typical timescale that which nodules grow. Typical nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone are something to 2 to 5. The oldest nodule was 10 million years old that was dated. Then the other question is what the sediment plume and the resettlement also outside the mining areas and the nodule areas will do. And this is where we still have, of course, gaps of data because all these small experimental suspension of sediment plumes that we can do on scientific vessels will not be able to answer the real impact that is to be expected. We hope to see that and investigate that when these first industrial collector systems will be tested. So here we did a small experiment in situ in 4,000 meter water depth in an area with nodules that you can see here, suspending sediment in an experiment and then sampling it and looking for myofauna, in this case nematodes. And what we can see is that with a resettlement of sediment, we see an significantly increased mortality of these nematodes when the sediment cover or blanketing was larger than 1 centimeter in this case. So with this, we're trying to actually determine and quantify also the impacts and when there are harmful effects will start. But we haven't done that, of course, for all the different kinds of faunal classes and species that exist. We are at the moment only at the stage where we have or starting to get these kind of numbers and quantifications for a few species. So overall, this in the end means that we need to have conservation areas that need to match the habitat characteristics of the mined areas to preserve abyssal biodiversity and vulnerable ecosystems. Since this is so variable on even small spatial scales, this is not an easy task to do. Then we also have to minimize the larger scale impacts that might come from the fact that for example, over distances like the Clarion-Clipperton zone, we know that species are genetically connected to each other. So we need to avoid that this connectivity breaks down due to mining operations in between. And these questions we can't answer right now because we don't have enough data and knowledge on it. So adaptive spatial planning of mining operations is probably one of the key things that ISA in the mining code have to think about. Since you have, if we look at this lower graph here, if you have your mining area where you do some mining and have preservation areas around, then you will have this direct impact area, but also due to the plume distribution, you have an impact area that is much larger. And so you have to think about it with spatial planning of these operations to minimize the really large scale impacts on sizes of the entire Clarion-Clipperton zone. So what we also try to do, and still have a lot to do, is to define indicators of ecosystem health for these deep sea environments and threshold values for these harmful effects that are needed for the regulations of the International Seabed Authority. Yeah, and then what is also important is that transparent and independent scientific assessment of these deep sea mining operations need to be secured. So what we can say is that we have the tools, at least in science, to monitor these operations and the environmental impacts. And this has also to be transformed or transferred to industry now, that they also have all these tools and knowledge available. Yeah, and with this, I actually want to stop my presentation and happy to take your questions later on. So unfortunately, due to this short time, I can't extend on all the different kinds of impacts, but we're also looking next year on other impacts like that come from noise and light pollution potentially from these machines.
Thank you so much, Matthias. And also, I just wanted to note, your little video showed a clip for, I think you're working over 4 kilometers water depth. When you see a little video on a webinar, you don't quite realize the effort and technology and skill that goes into doing such a very, very simple experiment. So I really appreciated you showing that short video. So our last speaker today, as I mentioned, sadly, we don't have Clement with us speaking on Indigenous rights. I hope he will be able to send us a video that we can share with you after this webinar. So our last speaker, before we move to the discussion session, will be Salim Ali. And Salim will discuss possible alternatives to deep sea mining in terms of obtaining raw materials for green energy and other technologies, and how to comparatively evaluate their relative impact in the environment and society. Now, Salim is Professor of Energy and Environment at the University of Delaware. He is Senior Fellow at Columbia University Center of Sustainable Investment and an advisor on impact evaluation for Deep Green, a deep sea mining company. Based on their sponsoring partnership with 3 small island developing nations, Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati. With a focus on conflict resolution, particularly related to extractive industries, Salim was elected to the UN International Resource Panel in 2017. Salim, great pleasure to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Murray. A pleasure to be on. Thanks to the Edinburgh team for organizing. I've put forward just a link on the first slide, which is to a new initiative. We've launched a platform which deals specifically with this issue of what are alternatives for different sources of metals, and it's called Mineral Choices. I would urge the participants to check out the website and join the newsletter, because we want to share the latest science and commentary related to sourcing metals from a variety of sources and what alternatives are there, what's the latest research. And those of you who are into social media, welcome to follow me on Twitter as well. Okay, now, first of all, when we think of alternatives, we need to consider a systems perspective from a planetary point of view. because any kind of metal sourcing inevitably is going to lead us into conversations around the interconnections between supply and demand. So the first option we have is reducing metal demand. If you want to think about alternatives, the first option, which environmentalists would rightly point out, is that if we reduced aggregate demand for metals, for green technologies, we would have less need to mine, right? So now there are constraints to that. Population constraints, how much we want to micromanage society. Those are questions for society to address, but we have to keep our eye on the ball that aggregate demand is one of the key issues for concern. And one of the concerns which comes from that is that if you make processes more efficient, if you make the recovery of metals more efficient, you can also get an increase in demand because people see there's more opportunity and then they can end up having just as big an impact. So efficiency doesn't always solve the problem. That's something we call the rebound effect. And that's why the total aggregate demand must always be measured. The other is switching to products which have more circular metallic flows. So possibly existing stocks where they may be available. So of course, I think the goal should be moving towards a more circular economy, but we can only do that if we have metal stocks. And the reality is that most of the research which is out there, considering the demand that's going to be projected for a lot of metals, particularly for electric vehicle batteries, suggests that we may not be able to meet it with the current stocks. So we have to first build those stocks. Maybe it will take 30, 40, 50 years to build those stocks through extraction, and then we will be able to have enough to move forward. Currently, I would submit to you, there are a few metals where we do have enough stocks. Gold is one. If we really think about gold, where there is enough gold above ground for us to have a totally circular economy for gold. There is enough gold and bank vaults and existing supplies of jewelry, stocks which are not necessarily being used, and international reserves of gold that we don't really need to mine gold. However, the reason we mine gold is because there are about 40 million people who are dependent on artisanal mining. Banks don't want to release their gold supply because there is, still, even though we don't have the gold standard, there is still this imperative to hoard the gold. So there are other geopolitical reasons, but that's one metal where we could, but we don't for other reasons. But that's a societal choice. Thorium is another one. If we had nuclear reactors that were working on thorium, we would actually not need to mine any more uranium. We have enough material to source it from existing wastes that are stockpiled to be able to source them. But we don't yet have the full upscaling of the technology to have that. So that's just an example. If we're thinking about green technology, we could potentially have thorium reactors which could be completely circular in terms of their waste flow coming from existing stocks. So that's one side of it, alternatives, right? A systems alternative. We could also switch to products with organic inputs that can be cultivated. Instead of having metals, which are geological resources, and they are not renewable in terms of planetary timescales, they are renewable in chemical timescales because recycling implies that they're renewable at a chemical level. And you can't, if you have copper, you can convert copper to copper oxide if you oxidize it, but you just have to inject more energy to get the copper back out of that new compound, right? So it's not that you have lost the copper, it's just that you put it in a form that you need to put more energy to get it out. But when we're talking about renewable resources on biotic timescales, which is what we're talking about with organic materials, then we can do it much faster and with less energy potentially, because we're using existing biotic systems of energy, the sun and so on, working with microbes in the soil and all. So there you have biofuels. That has its own problems, but that's an alternative potentially. We have concerns about biofuels in terms of land acquisition and the problems that come from that. We also have organic radical batteries. This is a new area, it's fascinating. There's some work out of University of Southern California just in the last few months where they've developed compounds, quinones, and you could use those potentially in batteries though most of these batteries still require some metal catalysts for operation, and they usually require some kind of a metal for one of the electrodes. But still, I'm all for science to continue with such research. You have to evaluate the carbon balance. That's the key. If you're concerned about green technology from the point of view of reducing the carbon footprint, you need to employ techniques like life cycle analysis to do these comparisons and then figure out what's the best possible outcome. Now, if we come to metals, what are the sources of metals? So that was the systems perspective, big picture, what are the different ways in which we can deal with the energy transition? But if we figure out that metals are going to be needed, then where do we get them from? Well, we have the terrestrial mining, which can be in areas with competing human uses. You can't really have mining currently happening under the City of London because we've got competing land use, right? Similarly, you may not be able to have mining in indigenous lands because for cultural reasons, indigenous people may say, we don't want mining to happen. So we have to think that about, where you could also have situations where human population is not there as much an issue, but you have compromised biodiversity. So we have that concern clearly in parts of the Amazon, where we may not have necessarily as high level of human habitation. Sometimes you do, you have indigenous people there too, but there are some parts where there may not be as much human habitation, but then you have biodiversity compromise. Then you have coastal mining, which was talked about. And coastal mining is in national waters. We do have some record of coastal mining, not for metals, but for diamonds in Namibia, where it's been going on for many years. De Beers has been mining off the coast of Namibia for diamonds with these huge vacuum systems. But not as much for metals has been done, but that could be potentially an area. And then we have the deep sea mining metals, which we've talked about quite a lot already. And then finally, we have the resources from recycling of metal stocks. But the key there is we have to first build the stock in order to be able to recycle. And we have to ask whether we can do that or not. So this is a map which comes from a paper myself and a few colleagues published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society a few years ago, which looks at biodiversity and mining overlap in terms of protected systems. So if you think about this map, the green areas are actually those where you have relatively low biodiversity, and one could say that you could have extraction done with less consequential impacts in terms of planetary systems. Of course, every ecosystem has its value. We have concerns about, like, I know in solar panels and in the deserts of California, there have been concerns about the desert tortoise, because you need very large areas of desert land for these solar panels, and what will happen to the desert tortoise habitat. Well, similar concerns there, but it's all about trade-offs. Sorry, but there's no free lunch. You have to figure something out in terms of where the trade-offs are, and that's for society to figure out through a deliberative process. You've got also these other systems clearly where you've got a lot of mining and forested systems, which are very high biodiversity. So that's another part of the trade-off concern. Last slide. This is a more recent paper by Laura Saunter and colleagues from University of Queensland, just came out in Nature Communication, and it's looking at also the criticality of the metal and where you have also the mine density. So, they're looking at it from the point of view of these options with regard to biodiversity from the point of view of which metals are most critical. And that's where the debate with oceanic minerals becomes most consequential. So the bottom line is alternatives are there, but there are tough choices. We need to do very careful analysis in terms of industrial ecology techniques like life cycle analysis to see what are the comparative impacts. And if we want to go the circular economy route, which of course we do, we have to build the stocks of the metals in order to be able to recycle. And we can do that currently not for many metals. Hopefully we will at some point, especially if we are able to stabilize the Earth's population at some level, we will be able to do that, which is expected in the next 50 years or so. But we don't know. We may develop situations where life expectancy increases. As someone who does a lot of futuristic research on science, there are a lot of unknown variables in terms of what will happen with demography in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Salim, very, very many thanks for that presentation. And that brings us to the end of the series of presentations that we had. And I've been wonderfully impressed with the questions and also the answers from panelists that have been coming and going in their Q&A. So thank you so much. What we'll now do is spend the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so together with the panel going into some of your questions in a little bit more detail. And I wanted actually to kick off with a question that came in quite early at 5:29 from Finlay Pringle in Ullapool. Finlay Pringle is a young man who is a shark ambassador and passionate for the future of sharks. And actually Finlay has asked a really insightful question. If the panel haven't seen it, I will repeat it. And I'll go first to Pradeep. And Pradeep, if you could prepare an answer, I'll then maybe finger a couple of other people. But Finlay's question is, who will be responsible for the environmental monitoring? And panelists, do feel free to turn your cameras on so that we can all see you again.
I was in the process of answering that one, actually typing into the notes, but I'll leave you to it, Pradeep. Go for it.
No, why don't you go ahead first? I'll come after you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, yeah, that there are, the ISA is talking, or well, is looking at the establishment of an inspectorate, but, you know, is that a self-inspectorate? How does one keep a level of independence if you are actually managing and running a kind of a body that is inspecting the work that you have prescribed yourself? So, you know, that's it. But a lot of it currently is looking at self-regulation too. So, you know, Pradeep, that's where I was starting anyway, is the inspectorate and self-regulation. And then how does one actually do this in the Great Ocean?
Yeah, okay. So I think there are a few layers to this. So at the project level, the ISA currently envisages that contractors will conduct monitoring activities. So they're required to submit an environmental management and monitoring plan. So maybe after me, Samantha could say a few words on this EMMP. And then at a broader scale, at a regional scale, there is an expectation that the ISA will set up a monitoring sort of program. And some colleagues and I are actually developing a policy brief now to suggest a regional monitoring scheme, basically to do this as per, like, for the region as a whole, with the help of sponsoring states, for example, to get them also involved in this monitoring thing. But at a project scale, it is clear that contractors will be doing this, and the job of the inspectorate, which Pippa mentioned, which is yet to be established and operationalized, they're supposed to sort of ensure that compliance is being done in this way. And then at a higher scale, the responsibilities at the ISA to ensure that there is monitoring going on. And I guess the ISA is also, or has also sort of developed, or in the process of developing, guidance for contractors on creating preservation reference zones and impact reference zones, so IRZs and PRZs. And these are going to be used also as monitoring points. But Samantha, I think you could speak more on that.
Thanks, Pradeep. Yeah, so the environmental management and monitoring plan, which there isn't one that yet exists for a mining project in the area, because we are still in the exploration phase. However, it is one of the requirements of a plan of work for exploitation or mining application, and it will need to outline. It'll need to carry on from the environmental impact assessment and environmental impact statement, where it says these are the environmental impacts and effects anticipated. This is the plan to monitor them, and there will be certain conditions, I suppose. So, for example, if you set an area aside, and contractors must set an area aside called a preservation reference zone or zones. So one of the goals would be, of course, that preservation reference zone remains unimpacted from mining or from any sediment plumes, which Matthias mentioned. And a way that you could set up some monitoring is through the use of oceanographic moorings and buoys that basically send you pingers or send you warnings if you're getting if a sediment plume is getting close to that preservation reference zone, and that a lot of that can be done live or in real time. So you don't necessarily, I mean, I'm just trying to take into account some of the questions that have come in on the questions and answers to. You don't necessarily need to have eyes on the seafloor at all time. You can have sensors that are set to ping when you're at risk of coming outside of an environmental obligation or outside of an impact that's been predicted. Hope that helps.
Thank you very much for those answers. Would anyone else like to come in on that point, or on Matthias? Go ahead.
Yeah, so the monitoring technology for the plumes, we actually have in science, and the industry companies, the contractors are using most of those technologies for the exploration also anyway. So they have this technology available. So what Samantha said, with kind of moorings put next to the preservation reference zones to see if they get, or ensure in the end that they don't get impacted, that is technologically possible. The other thing that I find quite interesting, I know we had a workshop, an ISA workshop on that, where this came up, and not all the companies or countries were happy with that. But compliance of this monitoring from the contractors could be monitored by the sponsoring states. I mean, that could be one of the obligations they have to face. I know that some countries weren't happy in that discussion, but I don't know, maybe Pradeep, you know something about the current discussion status, because this workshop was already 2 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think there has been much development in that sense. And as you know, in some cases, sponsoring states are small island developing states, and without so much capacity to actually, or financial capacity to do this. So indeed, it's going to be perhaps, you know, a requirement that is hard for them to comply with. So definitely, this is something that we need to look into, you know, more detail, in a more detailed perspective. But perhaps, you know, sponsoring states could come together and assist the ISA at a regional scale, for instance, to conduct monitoring at a regional scale instead of just focusing on the individual contract. So that is one potential solution that, you know, some of us are trying to put forward to sort of involve the sponsoring states as well in this process, to take responsibility of monitoring.
Thank you very much. So Finley, I hope that was a helpful answer, but I think it's worth noting, maybe back to Pippa's point, that as things stand in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, the body responsible for issuing licenses is, as I understand it, also the body responsible for monitoring environmental management, in monitoring all aspects of the equation. And that has raised an awful lot of concerns. I think that's fair to say. That in English, we have a phrase that you're both poacher and gamekeeper. So that's, I think, one of the critical issues that we are aware of. So thank you very much for that question. I'd like to jump, I'll do this actually. I'll jump from issue to issue in rather an idiosyncratic manner, but I think it's the only way to handle the questions as they've come in. I have a question here from Anne Dom, targeted towards Salim. I think maybe Salim, you've read the question because you know you'll answer it live. Let me summarize. There's a link to the EEA website, published a recent paper on growth without economic growth, making clear that if the world is to stay within planetary boundaries, we have to let go of the GDP growth paradigm and develop new type of economies, a post-growth donut economy, a sharing economy, etc. I find these things fascinating, Salim. I don't quite know what a donut economy is, but the concepts are getting a lot of airtime, and it does seem we need, you know, we need to do things differently. It's becoming increasingly clear. So are you looking at these kinds of alternatives, which may be much more transformative than technology innovation and circular economy alternatives?
Yes, thanks. And so, you know, this is a classic systems question about sufficiency, basically. Can we move towards a more modest way of living, essentially? The challenge we have is that we have to balance the level of human choice with the level of planetary constraints. and the great Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, he wrote a paper many years ago. It was called The Impossibility of a Paretian Liberal, which basically said that in a Pareto optimal system, you cannot really get Pareto optimality. Pareto optimality means you're trying to get a system where everyone's needs are optimally met in some way, if you also want a liberal society. Because if you allow for pluralism of choice at some level, people are going to want to consume based on what their choices are. You can educate them, you can try to inform them, but ultimately you are constrained, right? So the challenge we have is, how can we enforce some degree of that sufficiency without constraining individual choice if we want to live in democratic systems with some level of freedom of choice? So it's a really difficult issue. The donut paradigm is a good one. This is Kate Raworth, from former Oxfam and now teaches at Oxford and has her own consulting business. So you can look up her Donut Economics website. But she basically came up with this paradigm that you have the planetary boundaries, which is the Johan Rockström and William Steffen framework for saying that, it's very controversial, I might say, even among ecologists, that you have certain constraints that the planet, in order to sustain life, requires us to keep this kind of sweet spot, this Goldilocks zone of planetary indicators. And she has added a social floor to it, hence the donut, because you have the planetary ceiling and then you have the social floor, which is the minimum level of human development. Poverty levels need to be decreased and so on. So that's the tension. And to live in that donut is the aspiration. The GDP indicator, it's easy to malign it, and I am one of those who has maligned it a lot in my writings, but GDP is a very simple indicator, that's why it's used so much by development economists. If you're looking at poverty alleviation, where we are living in a world of such great inequality, we cannot think of a single example of any country which has risen from least developed to developed without its GDP increasing. So if you are using GDP as a measure for development from being a low developed country, moving to developed status, then GDP is an adequate measure. However, if you are comparing within developed economies, it is an inadequate measure. So we do need to definitely refine that. We have quality of life indicators which are being used. The UN has a happiness index. Every year now they're publishing the Global Happiness Report, which has a composite of numerous variables. Jeffrey Sachs was a colleague from Columbia who has, of course, been one of the architects of the SDGs. He has been forefront in developing the happiness report. So there are a lot of other indicators, but we can't throw out GDP either, because sadly we are still living in a world where, imagine, 1 billion people don't even have access to electricity, let alone, electricity is now considered a human right to some degree, and 1 billion people still don't have that. So, we have this enormous gap that still will require to be filled. So we can't talk about sufficiency quite yet for those people. We can talk about it for the rich countries.
Thank you very much, Salim. Would anyone else on the panel like to come in on this point? Otherwise, I'm going to move the discussion to a slightly different area. I think it's a really important and super fascinating issue, and one that we're going to see grow in importance. Okay, let's move to a slightly different area from our audience. Kyra Walton asks a question relating to the biological aspects of our webinar today. Is it possible to sample organisms found on the seabed due to the pressure and temperature differences alongside other abiotic drivers? Or is all knowledge obtained by observation from ROVs, so remote vehicles, or other similar means? How can we know all of the impacts of deep sea mining on organisms surrounding mining sites without knowing information such as their chemical composition, feeding habits, or reproductive methods? So it's really a question, I think, for maybe Daniela or Pippa, who would like to have a go at discussing some of those issues? Or Matthias?
I don't know. Maybe I'll just start. if the others are fine with that. So we can do in situ experiments, for example, to understand the food web and the food web structure. It's the first thing. We don't have an understanding in the deep sea of the ecosystem itself. There is no ecosystem model, for example. But we're doing these small steps. We sample also the different fauna and species over the different faunal classes. For example, with an ROV, the megafauna and box cores for macrofauna, multi-cores, so small liners of sediment for myofauna, and bacteria. We can do in situ measurements of oxygen, for example, that tell us something about oxygen demand by the microbes. We can put little chambers like you've seen in the video that I showed, also with electrodes in there to measure the respiration. We can put them on top of, for example, a sea cucumber to figure out over a day or two what their respiration rates is. So that we have some tools, but of course it's a tedious task, and the full picture on the ecosystem we don't have yet. So maybe that's just my part on it now.
Thank you, Matthias. Would anyone else like to comment on that wider issue around the uncertainty of basic knowledge of the ecosystems within which deep sea mining will take place?
Well, maybe I'll just comment on the way this is often operationalized as the precautionary principle. And this goes back to the Agenda 21 and the Rio Summit of 1992, where the precautionary principle was enshrined. The precautionary principle basically states if you don't know enough, then you err on the point of caution. However, we have to find ways of actually operationalizing it, because on its own, it can't be used as a means of scientific decision-making. So what I think is important is that civil society, the academic community, and governments need to figure out how do we operationalize the precautionary principle in times of uncertainty. IUCN, some years ago, they came up with a framework, that's the International Union for Conservation of Nature, around how to actually use the precautionary principle in policy. I think we need to revisit that, because it's thrown around that we have uncertainty. So, uncertainty can't be used as a mechanism for essentially not having any decision making. So we have to figure out how to operationalize it better.
Murray, I would agree. I think that the precautionary principle has to be applied here, but until we have more certainty on the scientific evidence around risks and impacts, then we do need to proceed with extreme caution. Yeah, so we're not there yet. I don't think we don't know enough to really determine whether we should be going full tilt ahead with this at all. And I'm part of an IUCN motion, which is being brought to light. Well, it was postponed because it needed to go to full debate within the Assembly around calling for a pause, essentially a moratorium, and in many people's languages, a halt on deep sea mining. So, and that's really because, and putting into place the precautionary principle, the need to have better scientific evidence. And these are very, very complex systems that we're talking about. They're planetary systems. They are part of a whole sort of evolution of life, if we go back to those points. And we honestly just don't know enough right now to be making the kinds of decisions that we're asking of humankind to make on behalf of our own demand for consumption of raw materials. So these are massively esoteric questions that we're facing as humanity, and I think we've got to be able to answer them correctly and with eyes wide open.
Thank you, Pippa. And I think that's a really natural link. So Sam, let me go to you. You have your hand up. Sorry, I missed that.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to say that I agree with what speakers before me have said. A precautionary approach is needed. We do need more evidence. We do need more research. I would, though, and something that hasn't been mentioned yet, I would, though, like to point out that is exactly what the ISA requires. There are draft regulations and recommendations that require a huge list of environmental baseline studies and impact assessment studies that must be completed prior to an application for mining. And I think we do have to understand that until mining happens, there will always exist some level of unknowns. And the more unknowns there are, the more conservative our environmental management approaches need to be. And as we learn more, then we can make those less strict. And so I think that takes into account a precautionary approach and also an adaptive management approach to environmental management. But I don't think anyone should go away thinking that that's representing very different views. I think we all agree that more research is needed, more work is being done, and that it is so imperative that we are making science-based, evidence-based decisions as we move forward.
Pradeep, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think just a very quick point on that. Germany, for instance, in October 2019, submitted some proposals, and one of this included like having a two-stage mandatory test mining approach, basically at the first stage requiring contractors to demonstrate, when they seek to move from exploration to exploitation, to demonstrate through test mining that they are able to sort of meet environmental requirements. And then at the second stage, when you already have the exploitation contract, but before you go into commercial production, to again satisfy, through demonstration or through evidence that this can be done in a manner that meets the environmental requirements. So this is indeed one option that is on the table that member states would have to sort of discuss when they negotiate the draft regulations. And this is perhaps one way to effectively implement the precautionary approach to make the approval contingent on the actual contractor's ability to demonstrate that they can carry it out. But this is something that is on the table for negotiations.
Thank you. I'll tell you, it's quite difficult to stay on top of the questions. So I do apologize if I know I'm missing critical questions and we'll run out of time. Let me just move the discussion along to a slightly different issue. A question I think that's rather intriguing from Hannah Grant came in at 6:30, if you want to scan to it. For Matthias, the setting aside of conservation areas to match mine sites is surely problematic due to the far-reaching effects of sediment plumes. This potentially rules out nearby site options, which may be the most representative. Can you say more about these challenges and possible options?
Yeah, so I mean, for the far site set ones, I mean, we have the CC or around the CCZ, one has to say the 9 APEIs, but we don't know if they are suitable or representative. They haven't been studied very much. One idea for some of them was that there is a certain amount of seamounts which have also fauna on hard substrates of the seamount sites. We actually figured out on our cruises in 2015 that they are not representative for the fauna in the nodule area. So this basic idea for some of the APEIs doesn't really work out for the nodule habitat. And so we're actually recommending to have smaller areas, preserved areas, and not just one per contract area, but several of them. But this is a different thing. So you could think about kind of a chest plate mining preservation area system in each contract area. What we don't know at the moment is how far this plume travels and has an impact. This could be tens of kilometers, could be only 1 or 2. There might be technical options also to reduce the spread of an impact. So at the moment, this is really difficult to answer if smaller areas set aside work out and are representative or not. So it is one of the things I think where this adaptive spatial management has to come into place. And if mining is going to go ahead, the regulations have to make sure this precautionary approach that we start with a few mining operations, maybe only, before, let's say, 20 contractors at the same time start to do that. And we have to learn over the coming years. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthias. And I think actually, okay, Sam, I will go to you. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I just wanted to add that I think Matthias has highlighted exactly, it was one of the critical components of the baseline study and of the impact assessment. Whether it's a bunch of smaller areas or a couple larger areas, protected areas, I think, are increasingly being recognized as a key environmental management strategy for in particular polymetallic nodule provinces. And that'll be a key part of the baseline studies and impact assessment is demonstrating that what is being proposed to be set aside is indeed representative of what would be impacted by mining and by plumes. And then I would also like to say that there is a lot of work being done to try to minimize the plumes and keep them as much as possible within the area that's directly mined. And of course, the Mining Impact 2 project that Matthias mentioned will help to elucidate that going forward as they monitor the upcoming GSR Petenia 2 trial.
Thank you. Let me evolve the discussion on a little bit to a question that's come in from Helen Shersky. It's an interesting question that people might want to read from 632. The experience of everything on the ocean surface, fishing, pollution, human rights, etc., is that it's a lawless place because it's so hard to track and enforce any of it, even in 2D. The ocean is massive, and Helen recommends reading Outlaw Ocean for more information. Why should we have any confidence that we'll do better on the seafloor and in areas far from any nation's jurisdiction? I add that. It's even more difficult and expensive to monitor outside national jurisdiction, and it's always someone else's fault. How do we learn from mistakes at the sea surface? Who would like to take that one on?
I'll have just an initial bash. I mean, I think the governance of the high seas is the hugest challenge. You know, I think we have clear evidence of the risks and impacts, so we know this is going to be an incredibly damaging and very long-term to outcomes for the ocean. But all of that sits within regulation, so that there are standards and regulations being set, and all the sort of frameworks that one could ask for that already exist in highly regulated national systems, and then suddenly we've got this international one, which is really is out there in no man's land. And how we maintain the governance of those and ensure that the operators, and I'm not pointing fingers at anyone right now, but it's just we know that companies in terrestrial environments, the reason we do have breaching tailings dams, etc., is because there are failures in the governance and failures in practice. And how one prevents failures in the open ocean is that's a question someone needs to answer and provide me with a surety that will happen. We don't even have a benchmark standard yet. The regulations are not calling for high enough objectives around harm or impact or the performance of the operators yet. We don't have things like we do on terrestrial environments with net positive impact to biodiversity or zero emissions of carbon, etc. These are not part of that framework yet. So how we can hold everyone to account to actually ensure that these standards are implemented is a very, very good question. We've talked a little bit about the idea of an inspectorate, about self-moderation of an application of standards. It will be a nigh impossible thing to do, I think. But if it can be done, well, show me how.
Well, I think I agree with the concern being raised that the monitoring of the high seas is very difficult. But keep in mind, one of the reasons why there is this lack of governance is because people do not live in the high seas and physically living there. You don't have contested property rights issues in the same way in terms of residence. You could have disputes on fishing rights and quotas and so on. So there is a qualitative difference which has led to that dynamic. And then when you're talking about the deep sea, you have an even more additionally sort of distant layer from human habitation. That's not to diminish its importance, but it goes back to a fundamental ethical aspect of how much do we have more of an anthropocentric view of governance, of where humans are more directly connected to the ecosystem compared to ecosystems where humans are not as directly connected. And so here the issue is much more about biodiversity. Now we do have a new treaty that is being negotiated, the Bbnj Treaty, which is around under the UN auspices within the Law of the Sea framework, which is specifically focused on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. That may be one way to address this concern. It is not perfect by any means, but it shows that there is momentum, and we've had a high-level panel on oceans recently within the UN system that has come up with a series of recommendations. So there is recognition, but at the same time, you know, when you're comparing to terrestrial mining, and having worked a lot of my career there, the issues are very qualitatively different. I mean, there you have physically human beings are being displaced from their homes, so you can put a mine there. It's different from a species that is being dislodged in the deep sea. I'm not saying it's necessarily to diminish it by any means, but it is different. And we can't ignore that. If we ignore that, I mean, we're sort of going into self-delusion, because there is this proximate versus ultimate impact.
Thank you, Salim. You make excellent points. And I think it really highlights to us all on this webinar what an amazing issue this is. You know, we're at the nexus of so many really, really critical issues. And the way I want to start drawing our thoughts to a conclusion on this is to come back to the fact that the areas outside any nation's jurisdiction, which, as Salim notes, are subject of a very special negotiation at the United Nations on a new legally binding instrument to manage biodiversity. This doesn't happen every year or every decade or every 25 years. It's a very special moment in time. It's happening right now. Thanks to COVID, it's postponed, it's delayed. We all watch with great interest and hope that it restarts soon. But if you're on the webinar and are not connected in or following that negotiation, do look at it. Google Bbnj United Nations. It will all pop up, and it's well worth a look. But let's remember that UNCLOS enshrines not just the minerals of the deep sea, but the other benefits of the deep sea for the common heritage of humankind. The genetic resources of the deep ocean might be something we consider in that framework. And I think there's a question from Colin Moffat. Colin is based here in Scotland, in Aberdeen. And Colin asks, how do we approach obtaining the views of society? So this is an issue for the common heritage of mankind. And I think that's a very insightful question. Who would like to have a crack at that one? Do I see a finger raised or an eyebrow moving that I can zero in on somebody? Otherwise, I will choose somebody. I think I'm going to go first to Pippa. You spoke last, but would you mind having a crack at that one? And then I might ask Pradeep.
Yeah, you know, touched a little bit on the role of society in my presentation, and the sort of onus really is on the individual and how we communicate that. I mean, very few people actually know what deep sea mining is about. So this webinar, as I say, is a really important part of that education process. But we need full transparent disclosures of what it entails, and I think, you know, that needs to be balanced and it needs to be well informed, and it certainly needs to be inclusive of the evidence that is coming in from all quarters, from the science, from the practitioners, but also we need to balance that with the sort of stuff that Salim has talked about around sustainable material resources and the use of resources and the circular economy and our own role in society as consumers and what we are demanding on the system, on the natural system and on the mineral system. So, you know, we need to educate, we need to communicate with society, and we need them to inform our decision makers, the people who are representing us in the ISA and are representing us in making policy and regulations around these things, to be able to make informed decisions on our behalf very often. But I think there's a lot of vulnerability here because, you know, we get swept up by, you know, by all sorts of things. The media is not always very kind, it's not always very accurate, and it's not always unbiased either. So, finding a kind of pathway of truth in there is a really important one. And that comes back to kind of things like governance, where does it sit and who ends up being accountable? We have to be accountable, but we have to hold others to account too.
Thank you, Pippa. We are running very close to our end time, but let me just see if anyone else wants to come in on the issue of public engagement.
Just one quick point that was raised in the Q&A about COVID and how this has impacted. I think on public engagement, COVID has actually helped to bring many more conversations, just like the Zoom webinar. But there are many misconceptions about COVID in terms of how it's going to impact material demand. We have seen a 7% decline in carbon emissions in 2020, according to the emissions gap report. But this is, for one, this is not nearly enough to meet our targets, which we have under the Paris Agreement. In terms of material demand, it's a very mixed picture because we may see much more movement towards individual mobility as people are more constrained and do not want to use public transport. So we may end up seeing a higher demand for electric cars. We don't know. This is all something that is going to be figured out. So I think there is no room for complacence. These conversations must continue in terms of us trying to become more sustainable citizens, but also having a timeline for what those demands will be for the technologies needed to reach that goal.
Thank you, Salim. One last word from Pradeep, and then I move to start closing the webinar, but do go ahead, Pradeep.
Great, thanks. Well, just a very quick point. So unfortunately, it's at the ISA, and the ISA is comprised of member states, and in effect, they are the ones who are supposed to be representative of the the common heritage of mankind and mankind as a whole. But what can be done is that I think there needs to be a lot of movement within national jurisdictions and to sort of like discuss this issue more openly and more candidly and more widely. And this would then eventually sort of influence how that state sort of behaves at the ISA as well. And I think last summer there was like a hearing at the Belgian Parliament, for example, in which this discussion was sort of like openly held. And there should be more and more efforts like this across the rest of the member states.
Thank you, Pradeep. Now my honor to draw this webinar to a conclusion and thank everyone so much who spoke. You were brilliant, absolutely fantastic, and so easy to chair. You stayed beautifully to time. Much, much appreciate that. I can't wrap this up in a neat few words. We've covered so much territory. I hope people on the webinar will follow some of the links that have been in the chat, explore this issue in a bit more detail. And I think the critical take home is talk to people about it. So we need people to understand this issue from all sides and all areas. So if your nephews and nieces don't know about it, talk to them about it. If your grandmother doesn't know, tell her about it. If your partner doesn't know about it, make dinner, talk about deep sea mining. That, I think, is the most positive thing that we can all do moving forward to understand this issue and the challenges that we're facing. I think there's a final quote I've got. I wish I knew the name of the individual that came up with this quote. It's a Scandinavian environmentalist, I think, from the 1970s. But one of the phrases stuck with me. He referred to humanity as needing to live slightly less like cowboys on the frontier and to live on Earth as spacemen, whereby we think about our wastes, we think about the resource use, and we've covered that beautifully in the presentations that we've heard today. So to everyone on the screen in front of me and to everyone who joined us online, thank you so much, and we'll draw the webinar to a close there. Good night.